One of the first signs that Jesus told the disciples would indicate that the end of the age was approaching was wars and rumors of wars. I would say this is the easiest of all the signs to demonstrate took place in the first century. The fact that Josephus wrote a book entitled Wars of the Jews, which is all about calamities and wars throughout Israel in the first century, is in itself proof that wars and rumors of wars occurred during the apostolic age. And the fact that the first century Roman historians Suetonius and Cornelius Tacitus also wrote books describing worldwide calamities and civil wars proves that during the lives of the apostles, kingdom did rise against kingdom. The book that Josephus wrote is from beginning to end full of examples of the fulfillment of Jesus' predictions before that generation passed away. A few of the more remarkable examples concerning wars and rumors of wars are found in Wars Book 2, chapters 10 through 18, and Book 4, chapter 9. For instance, in Wars Book 2, chapter 10, Josephus described how there was a hazard of possible war between the Jews and Romans when Caligula commanded that a statue of himself be placed in the Jewish temple. The Jews absolutely refused to allow that, and there was fear that Caligula would retaliate with war. In chapter 17, Josephus described how the war between them began when Eleazar ben Hananias, the governor of the temple, who was also the son of the high priest Ananias, persuaded those officiating in divine service not to receive any gift or sacrifice for any Gentiles. Out of hatred he put an end to and forbade the daily sacrifices that were on behalf of the Caesar. The more moderate Jews who wanted peace with Rome feared retaliation from Caesar and tried with no success to get those who officiated in divine service to accept the sacrifices from Gentiles. Well, civil unrest and bloodshed ensued, not just between Jews and Romans, but between the Jews themselves. The seditious Jews brutally fought against both the Romans and the more moderate Jews, even killing each other in the temple courts. In chapter 18, Josephus records that every city in Syria was divided in war between Jews and Greeks. He records that at one point, 20,000 Jews were killed in a single hour's time in Caesarea. He also mentioned calamities at Alexandria in Egypt, where Jews and Greeks warred against each other. Besides wars in Judea, Egypt, and Syria, there were also great distresses among other nations, especially after the death of Nero. After Nero committed suicide, the empire erupted into civil war as various factions vied for power and men fought for the throne of emperor. Josephus records this in some detail in Wars Book 4, chapter 9. Tacitus and Suetonius recorded those and other conflicts in more detail. Now, something interesting that might go unnoticed while reading some of these examples is that Josephus seems to have recorded what I believe to have been the fulfillment of Luke chapter 21 verses 25 and 26, where Jesus predicted there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Look at a few excerpts from Josephus where he recorded the anxiety and fear among the Jews because of rumors of war and the things that were coming upon them. Okay, this first example, this is an excerpt from Josephus' book, Wars of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 10. And this was where Caius Caesar, also known as Caligula, commands that his statue should be placed or set up in the temple. Now Caius Caesar did so grossly abuse the fortune he had arrived at as to take himself to be a god, and to desire to be so called also, and to cut off those of the greatest nobility out of his country. He also extended his impiety as far as the Jews. Accordingly, he sent Petronius with an army to Jerusalem to place his statues in the temple, and commanded him that in case the Jews would not admit of them, he should slay those that opposed it, and carry all the rest of the nation into captivity. But God concerned himself with these his commands. However, Petronius marched out of Antioch into Judea with 3 legions and many Syrian auxiliaries. Now as to the Jews, some of them could not believe the stories that spake of a war. But those that did believe them were in the utmost distress how to defend themselves, and the terror diffused itself presently through them all, for the army was already come to Ptolemais. So here's an example of the Jews in Jerusalem being in great distress, great fear, because of rumors or stories that spoke of a possible war with Rome. This matches what Jesus said in Luke 21, verse 26. Secondly, in chapter 17 of the very same in chapter 17 of the very same book, if I scroll down toward the bottom of the chapter, or the end of the chapter, I'll just read a short excerpt from that. So Josephus says that in Jerusalem, the city was filled with sadness, and every one of the moderate men in it were under great disturbance, as likely themselves to undergo punishment for the wickedness of the seditious. For indeed it so happened that this murder was perpetuated on the Sabbath day, on which day the Jews have a respite from their works, on account of divine worship. And then finally, in chapter 22 of the same book, the Jews make all ready for the war, and Simon the son of Gioras falls to plundering. And thus were the disturbances of Galilee quieted, when upon their ceasing to prosecute their civil dissensions, they betook themselves to make preparations for the war with the Romans. Now in Jerusalem the high priest Artanus, and as many of the men of power as were not in the interest of the Romans, both repaired the walls and made a great many warlike instruments, insomuch that in all parts of the city darts and all sorts of armor were upon the anvil. Although the multitude of the young men were engaged in exercises without any regularity, and all places were full of tumultuous doings, yet the moderate sort were exceedingly sad, and a great many there were who, out of the prospect they had of the calamities that were coming upon them, made great lamentations. There were also such omens observed as were understood to be forerunners of evils by such as loved peace, but were by those that kindled the war interpreted so as to suit their own inclinations. And the very state of the city, even before the Romans came against it, was that of a place doomed to destruction. However, I'll just leave it at that. So anyway, these are 3 examples of what I believe to be the fulfillment of Luke chapter 21, verses 25 and 26. At this point, some might dismiss this as irrelevant to Luke chapter 21, verses 25 and 26, because while Josephus writes about the consternation that the Jews were in over the expectation of war, Jesus said men would be fearful because of the roaring of the sea. When Christians read Luke 21, 25 through 26, they generally assume that Jesus was speaking in literal terms about the sea and its waves roaring and causing great worry among men because of the fear of what such things might forewarn. but it is possible that Jesus was making use of metaphoric imagery that was common in Hebrew poetry and apocalyptic language. It wasn't uncommon for Hebrews to think of the surrounding enemy nations as the sea and the land of Israel as the earth. Sometimes the Hebrew writers would poetically describe the clashing of surrounding enemy nations as the roaring of the sea and its waves. Consider this clip from a video by the Bible Project, and think about how Jesus may have been using this very concept to describe tensions between the Jews and their enemies during the last days, and consider that the fear Jesus said would overwhelm men in the last days could have referred to the Jews' fear of conflict with their enemies.
And the metaphors we use shape our imaginations and our behavior. And so it's no surprise that the biblical poets constantly use metaphorical imagery.
Now, some metaphors in the Bible are easy to understand, like light is good and darkness is bad.
But remember, the biblical poets lived in an ancient culture, which means that some of their metaphors might seem kind of strange to us.
Like what?
Okay, so picture chaotic water, like a deep, stormy ocean.
Got it.
Now, think about a time you were in danger, and then map those two onto each other, and...
Danger is like chaotic waters.
Right. And then the biblical authors take it further. They also talk about dangerous people as stormy waters. Like in Psalm 69. Save me, O God, for the waters are up to my throat. I've entered the deep waters. My enemies outnumber the hairs of my head.
Oh, the enemies are dangerous waves.
Yes, and so are enemy nations. Like in Isaiah 17, woe to the nations that rage like the raging, roaring seas. Or in Psalm 89, O Lord, you rule the swelling seas. You scatter enemies with your mighty arm.
So this is a basic metaphor for danger and chaos in our world. But God has the power over chaotic waters.
Right. And this foundational image is so important, it's introduced on page 1 of the Bible.
Oh, right. The uncreated world in Genesis 1 is a dark, chaotic ocean that God brings order to.
Exactly. The image begins there and then develops throughout the rest of the Bible, and so does its opposite. If chaotic water is a fundamental image of danger, think about what dry land would represent.
Dry land would be safety, security, stability.
Exactly. Some of the most basic human desires. And that is what God's providing when the dry land appears in the opening pages of Genesis.
And this is also where God plants the Garden of Eden.
And it's no average garden. It's described with imagery of an ancient temple, high above those dangerous waters. And then from this garden temple flows a river that waters everything.
So the human ideal is to be with God in a mountain garden temple.
Yes, this image permeates biblical poetry. Like when David celebrates God's presence in the temple in Psalm 65.
How blessed is the one who's satisfied with goodness in your temple. A stream of God waters the land. You still the roaring of the waves and the turmoil of the nations.
Now watch. Because the temple was associated with being close to God's presence, this high rock could become a metaphor for God himself. Like in Psalm 18, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer.
And that's the image Jesus is drawing on when he says that listening to him is like building your house on the rock.
Exactly. And so notice how these rich metaphors in biblical poetry are rooted in images from earlier biblical narratives. That's how metaphors work in the Bible. You need the narratives to understand the poetic images, and the images reveal deeper meaning in those narratives.
Cool.
If you think it is unlikely or impossible that Jesus was using metaphors in his end times predictions, consider a few things. 1. Revelation, which is really an in-depth revealing of the same prophecy Jesus gave in Luke 21, clearly uses symbolism and metaphors to describe many of the events in the last days. So if Jesus' discourse in Luke 21 corresponds with Revelation, and it does, and Revelation uses symbolism, then Jesus' prophecy could also use symbols. 2. We find the idea of water being a symbol for people and nations in Revelation. Revelation chapter 17, verse 1, describes a city, the harlot city, which sits on many waters. In verse 15, The one speaking to the Apostle John interprets the vision of the waters as being a symbol for people and nations. Now consider that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 10, it says that the gathering of waters are called the sea. So in Revelation chapter 17, the gathering of Gentile nations, which are symbolized by many waters, can figuratively be referred to as the sea. In Luke 21:25 through 26, Jesus could have been using this concept. The sea is the surrounding nations, and civil unrest and geopolitical upheaval that threatens the security of the land of Israel is symbolized by the idea of the roaring of the sea and its waves. 3. Matthew 24 and Luke 21 correspond to each other. They are parallel passages referring to the same discourse that Jesus had with his disciples. In Matthew's version of the discourse, Jesus draws from the apocalyptic language that Isaiah used in Isaiah 13 and 34. In Matthew 24:29, the idea of the sun and moon growing dark and the stars falling from the sky is drawn from Isaiah 13:10 and Isaiah 34:4. But Isaiah 13 was foretelling the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian kingdom by the Medes. Isaiah 34 was predicting the destruction of Edom. Both prophecies were entirely fulfilled in the Old Testament. And in fact, Malachi chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 looks back at the fulfillment of Isaiah 34 and the destruction of Edom as an accomplished historical fact. Okay, I have Isaiah chapter 34 pulled up on the screen. Now this is a prophecy about a judgment that was going to come upon the land of Edom. And I'm going to read beginning in verse 4. And I want to remind you that in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, in verse 29, Jesus actually was drawing directly from this passage as well as from Isaiah chapter 13 in order to predict the end times calamities that were going to come. And so beginning in verse 4, it says, "And all the host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts will also wither away, as a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree. For my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom, and upon the people whom I have devoted to destruction. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is sated with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Wild oxen will also fall with them, and young bulls with strong ones. Thus their land will be soaked with blood, and their dust become greasy with fat. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Its streams will be turned into pitch, and its loose earth into brimstone, and its land will become burning pitch. It will not be quenched night or day. Its smoke will go up forever. From generation to generation it will be desolate. None will pass through it forever and ever. But pelican and hedgehog will possess it, and owl and raven will dwell in it. And he will stretch over it the line of desolation, and the plumb line of emptiness. Its nobles, there is no one there whom they may proclaim king, and all its princes will be nothing. Thorns will come up in its fortified towers, and nettles and thistles in its fortified cities. It will also be a haunt of jackals, and an abode of ostriches. The desert creatures will meet with the wolves. The hairy goat also will cry to its kind. Yes, the night monster will settle there, and will find herself a resting place. The tree snake will make its nest, and lay eggs there, and it will hatch and gather them under its protection. Yes, the hawks will be gathered there, every one with its kind." Now, notice Notice these verses that I have highlighted in yellow. Notice how it says that the land of Edom would be devoted to destruction, and that it would be from generation to generation, it would be desolate. And also that it would be a haunt of jackals. Now notice when I move over to Malachi chapter 1, and Malachi was written maybe 300 years or so after Isaiah 34. Malachi actually looks back at Isaiah chapter 34 as having been already fulfilled. And it says in Malachi 1, the oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord, but you say, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau, and I have made his mountains a desolation, and appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. Though Edom says, we have been beaten down, but we will return and build up the ruins. Thus says the Lord of hosts, they may build, but I will tear down, and men will call them the wicked territory, and the people toward whom the Lord is indignant forever. Well, notice that in verses 3 and 4, it says that God had made the land of Edom, or Esau, a desolation. Remember that Esau is Edom. Esau and Edom, or Edom was a name given to Esau according to Genesis chapter 36, I believe. Yeah, wait, hold on. All right, where's that? No, it's not. Yeah, it is in Genesis chapter 36. It says, now these are the records of the generations of Esau, that is Edom. And then in verse 8, it says, so Esau lived in the hill country of Seir. Esau is Edom. And so, as you can see, Malachi looks back at the destruction of Edom that was foretold in Isaiah 34 as an accomplished reality. And remember that verse. Remember those verses that I had highlighted in yellow. It said that the land of Edom would be devoted to destruction. It would be a desolation forever, and that it would be an abode of, or a haunt of, the jackals. Well, here it has, right here, that God had made Esau, or Edom, a desolation, and appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. So again, Malachi tells us that Isaiah 34 was fulfilled. Now, not only this, but also Isaiah 13. Remember, I said that in Matthew 24, verse 29, Jesus was drawing from both Isaiah 34 and Isaiah 13. Well, Isaiah 13 was a prophecy about the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian kingdom. It says, "The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Lift up a standard on the bare hill, raise your voice to them, wave the hand that they may enter the doors of the nobles. I have commanded my consecrated ones, I have even called my mighty warriors, my proudly exulting ones, to execute my anger. A sound of tumult on the mountains, like that of many people, a sound of the uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. They are coming from a far country, from the farthest horizons, the Lord and his instruments of indignation, to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. They will be terrified. Pains of anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel, with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light." That's what Jesus was drawing from in Matthew 24, verse 29. "The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will also put an end to the arrogance of the proud, and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. I will make mortal man scarcer than pure gold, all man and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place, at the fury of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning anger. And it will be that like a hunted gazelle, or like sheep with none to gather them, they will each turn to his own, and each one will flee to his own land. Anyone who is found will be thrust through, and anyone who is captured will fall by the sword. Their little ones will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered and their wives ravished. Behold, I am going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold, and their bows will mow down the young men. They will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eye pity children. And Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation, nor will the Arab pitch his tent there, nor will shepherds make their flocks lie down there. But desert creatures will lie down there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will live there, and shaggy goats will frolic there. Hyenas will howl in their fortified towers, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. And so it goes on, but the point is that this was a prophecy against Babylon, ancient Babylon. It was a prophecy saying that God was going to stir up the Medes against Babylon and destroy Babylon. And that was fulfilled in the Old Testament. And so Isaiah 13 and 34 were fulfilled in the Old Testament. But when those prophecies were fulfilled, the sun and moon were not literally darkened, nor did the stars literally fall from the sky, nor did the sky roll up like a scroll when Babylon and Edom were destroyed. That means the prophets were using hyperbole. Thus, since Jesus was drawing from those prophecies, some of the images and ideas in Jesus' discourse in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 could also be meant to be understood as symbols and hyperbole. Anyway, Jesus' prediction of wars and rumors of wars most definitely came to pass in the first century. I hope to be able to demonstrate in future videos that all of his other predictions also came to pass in that first century generation, just as he guaranteed in Matthew 24, verses 34 through 35, and Luke chapter 21, verses 32 through 33. But for now, I hope this helps. I will attach to this post a link to the book that Josephus wrote, Wars of the Jews, which is available to read online for free. And I encourage you to look up the chapters I referenced and read them for yourself. So go to the link and look up Book 2, chapters 10, as well as chapters 17 through 18, and chapter 22. Again, I hope you find this video helpful.